we're all here to celebrate the publication of Mimi Baird's heart-wrenching, beautiful book about her father, Dr. Perry Baird, who essentially disappeared from her life when she was not quite 6. He was ill at a time when his illness was not recognized as such, and so it was all swept under the rug. So from what I can understand, Mimi grew up in Boston, graduated from Colby Sawyer College, and after working at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, moved to Woodstock, which is where I met her a gazillion million years ago. And then while working at Dartmouth Hitchcock, she met a surgeon who actually knew her father, and that prompted what became a decades-long process of discovery. And I have to say, having read the book, that she has done the incredibly brave work of meeting lost family members, and in the process discovered papers that her father had written. And in sorting and reading those papers, she has uncovered an incredibly extraordinary, complicated individual. He was really ahead of his time, and I can only help think, but if he had been born 40 years later, his life would have been so different, and her life would have been so different. And hopefully now we'll do things differently. And I wanted to just read what Abigail Zuger wrote about the book in the New York Times, because I think it sums up the book better than I ever could. She says, "Its core is the full text of her father's manuscript, deftly annotated and explained. Around it, she layers the voices of caretakers, friends and relatives, and medical authorities. Events are revisited and reframed, turned inside out, and then right side up again. The book is autobiography, biography, science, history, and literature all in one, as instructive as any textbook and utterly impossible to put down." Please help me welcome Mimi Baird.
Would be very proud with that introduction. Full disclosure, I have bronchitis. Oh. So I brought today a box of meds. And if anybody has an illness or something that would be detrimental to being in the room with me, you can have one of these, all right?
Talk into the.
Yeah, we can't hear you
We
back
can't hear
here.
you at all.
Okay, there, is that better?
A little.
We'll adjust the audio.
Can you adjust it?
Yep.
I want to make sure. Is that better?
Yes.
Cindy, your seat is right down here.
I got ordered.
Is that better? All right, so you all understand, have little bronchitis. And if you need a mask, I have them up here. So now we'll begin. Before I begin, I would like to dedicate tonight to every single person in this room who made it possible for me to have the space, the quiet, and the solitude to write this book. You just don't know how important that's been. And I hope I can get through that. Oh, you know, I'm gonna say hi to Bill. I would also like to dedicate tonight to a wonderful woman, Betty Masterson, who died today at 3 o'clock. So, a special, she helped me a lot, helped a lot of us here, Coolidge Foundation, and she would have been here. She would have been here. So, what I'm going to do tonight is to read. This book is really a Boston, Texas book, but the creation of it and how it all came together happened here in the Upper Valley. And so I would like to read the prologue, because that happened in the Upper Valley, and I'm very proud that it did. And before I start, also,
your work.
I just would like to see a show of hands of how many people have either suffered from mental illness, know somebody who has suffered from mental illness, or has mental illness in their family. I see that's absolutely remarkable. Back in 1997, I gave a talk at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. This was a program started by Everett Koop called Poetry and Prose, and it allowed different people in the hospital to write about an experience that they had, a nurse, a doctor, a technician, even administrator like Dan Jansen, anybody who wanted to talk about something they'd experienced and in the process would help them to maybe come to grips with the experience. These were just little luncheons. You brought your brown bag, and we went into a room where there were at least maybe 10, 12 people there to listen to whomever was talking about whatever. And so my turn came. I went in this little room it's near the medical school, and there was nobody in the room. And I set up my things just like here today, and lo and behold, the woman who ran it came in and said, "Mimi, there are so many people here, we had to open auditorium A and B. There were 250 people, standing room only." And that's why I had you raise your hand, because it just shows we need to talk about this subject more, and this is why my father wrote this. So I'm going to read the prologue, because this is the thing that happened in the Upper Valley. It was the spring of 1994 when I returned from work to find a package containing my father's manuscript on my doorstep. I was 56 years old, and I'd been waiting for some word of him for most of my life. I was 6 years old child when he stopped coming home. My mother refused to say where he'd gone, except to tell me he was ill and away. That same year of 1944, she filed for divorce and quickly remarried, closing the chapter of her life that included my father. I was never taken to visit him growing up. His name was rarely mentioned in our house. Since childhood, I'd been informed in fleeting comments that he suffered from manic depression. I had seen him again only once, very briefly, before his death in 1959. The late afternoon light cast a long, sharp shadows across my entranceway and the box on the step. For decades, my father's manuscript had been kept in an old briefcase in the garage of a family member in Texas, all but forgotten. I had only recently learned of its existence. I picked up the carton and carefully brought it inside. I knew so little about my father, Perry Baird, only that he had been a doctor with a successful practice in Boston in his heyday. Yet I could vividly recall his presence in my early years, the gleaming white coat he wore at his offices, the sight of him at the Chestnut Hill train station where my mother took me to greet him returning from a day's work. After he disappeared, I felt the pain of a child who misses a parent, a feeling that had never completely left me. My hands trembling slightly, I took a knife and made a slit along the packing tape on top of the carton. Opening the flaps, I peered inside, glimpsing handwriting on the top sheaf. Cautiously, as if my father's words might bite, I took a piece of the paper between my thumb and forefinger. It was creamy and slightly translucent, of the onion skin kind used for making carbon copies in the days of the typewriter. I could see that it was covered with many lines of penciled script. I quickly put the page back and closed the carton. After 50 years of silence, it was going to take me a little while to work up the courage to hear from him again. Some days later, I opened the box, this time pulling out a handful of pages, then another. Soon the stack on my kitchen counter was over a foot tall. I attempted to read my father's words, but it was impossible to connect the sentences on one page with the next. Further investigation revealed that the papers had been shuffled out of order. After much searching, I located what appeared to be the title written in bold strokes, Echoes from a Dungeon Cell. It took many months to restore the manuscript to some semblance of order. As I rearranged the pages, I realized that these were my father's memoirs. For the first time, I learned what had happened to him in those years ago. He had not vanished, as I had sometimes suspected as a child. He had not left us. He had been removed against his will to Westboro State Hospital, a psychiatric institution just outside of Boston, where he had written about his experiences on the papers I held in my hand. My father was afflicted with a severe mental illness during a period before any effective treatment existed, many years before the advent of modern psychiatric medications. Like hundreds of thousands of mentally ill patients at that time, he was a victim of both his disease and the stigma surrounding it. He was shut away, institutionalized. His family advised to forget him, an edict my mother did her best to follow. The arrival of the manuscript in my life marked the beginning of a long journey to know my father, along with the other traces I found of him in letters, his published articles, medical records, and photographs. I was able to discover not only a father, but a writer and a scientist, a man whose insights were extraordinarily advanced for his time. Although Echoes from a Dungeon Cell were never published in my father's lifetime, it was his great hope that it would. One day find publication. In letters written after he departed Westboro, he explained, "Last year when I was ill, I went through a series of adventures, both colorful and painful. At that time, I was asked to write the story of some of my strange travels, and so out of the Cauldron of Despair came forth my manuscript. It is a long continued account of every kind of suffering and disaster, February 20th to July 8th, 1944. By going along slowly, depicting in detail the intricate succession of events, perhaps I can unravel and clarify the sequence of events and the relative importance of the various connecting links and contributing episodes. I believe that the inadequate understanding of manic depression, as displayed by friends and relatives, imposes unnecessary hardship on the manic depressive. I have read widely about manic depression. I have lived through 5 prolonged suicidal depression, 4 acute manic episodes, and many hypomanic phases. I have learned by experience how all the treatments feel: straitjackets, wristlets, anklets, injections, hot and cold packs, continuous tub, close confinement in small spaces, and all the many inventions that man has created for the manic psychosis. As a patient, I have studied many other patients at 4 psychopathic hospitals, including 1 city and 1 state hospital. Out of my recent agonies came a dauntless furor scribendi, and I have written a very readable book. It is my conviction, and I know you'll agree, that artistic creativeness finds its best expression after it has been fashioned by the agonies and tortures that life imposes. Now what I thought I would do is I've taken various quotations from the book, and I'm going to read them to you chronologically. So this will chronicle that day, February 20th, to his escape in July 8th, and 1944. And please don't think that I'm spilling the beans. There's plenty of where this came from in the book. A little background for some of you. In the 1930s and 1940s, no effective medication for manic depression existed, as there was also little understanding of how the illness worked and little compassion for its effects. It can be exhilarating and fascinating to be in the presence of a manic depressive who's on an upswing. Life for them is fun, bright, and full of adventure. On the other hand, when they're coming off a high, the situation is quite the opposite. That person can be mean and loud, physically threatening, behave inappropriately, become truly unpredictable, and drink a lot. And so it was, at times, with my father. I want to share my father's story and his writings, hoping they can provide insight for people who belong to families of the mentally ill or who are mentally ill themselves. We've come a long way in understanding manic depression. Medication has been developed, but we still have a long way to go in accepting the disease and finding a cure. Through medical research, my father tried to find the reason for his affliction. He was on the right track before the disease defeated him. Now, this is a quotation from his hospitalization in 1932 that cost my father his appointment as professor at the Harvard Medical School. This was devastating. In the first hours of hospitalization, Perry imagined crowds of people outside, attempting to get a look at a person who had made wonderful medical discoveries. Perry told the doctors he believed he was manic. After another hospitalization in 1934, he wrote to his mentor, Dr. Howard Means, chairman of the Department of Internal Medicine at Harvard, saying he had just endured, and I quote, 10 days of dark age psychiatry. This experience heightened his determination to seek a cure for his own ailment, and he added, I shall be willing to make whatever sacrifices are necessary to speed the progress of my experiments. Shortly before his incarceration on February 20th, he wrote, there was a phase of great strength, an ability to see things in the light of their happiest aspects, the ability to rise above disgrace, hardships, every type of defeat, carrying on with true courage, stamina, and fortitude for months. Then again, a sort of lagging, waning, a newer insight into events, people, an increased ability to see the distasteful side of certain past events and the compulsion to dwell on them, a great mass of dark memories collecting and whirling around madly in a vortex surrounding and engulfing consciousness. This is an example of, my father had many romances in spite of having a wife and 2 children at home. The last time I saw Renette was there at the entrance to the elevator in her father's apartment building. She seemed radiantly happy. I felt a little in love with her. I kissed her gently and said, goodbye. 2 days later, she tried to reach me. But by that time, I was locked up in the state hospital in Westboro. Did she fall in love with me briefly? Am I still in love with her? And this is one of my favorite passages that my father writes at this stage. The characters involved came to life as a daily occurrence on the stage of memory, and I seemed to form hands with them and frolic a little once again, as we did for a brief few hours before darkness closed in. Later he states, I feel suicidal as hell. My father writes the following the day of his public demise. I was back in my room at the Ritz. I slept deeply, but woke after only 3 to 4 hours of sleep, feeling that strange manic exuberance. I started out for a walk across the public gardens. I ran short distances and leaped wildly over the broad flower beds. I felt wonderful, but restless, reverently overactive, impatient. I felt possessed with demoniacal energy. I was acutely manic. And so begins the fateful day of February 20th. The following illustrates my father's perception of reality. He had returned to our home in Chestnut Hill and had jumped over a fence which surrounded a deer park that was directly behind our home. I saw a group of deer standing in the clearing. I wondered if I could run as fast as a deer or even catch one. I increased my pace by a sudden burst of speed. All of the deer turned around and ran. They soon outdistanced me. The following illustrates my father's physical strength during his manic phase. He goes to a friend's home and writes, I twisted the copper poker into a shape of a double circle. This excerpt shows how a manic person can intimidate others as well as show the potential for physical harm. His psychiatrist had come to the Ritz because my mother had called and said that my father was having a manic episode. And my father writes the following. Bob succeeded in causing me some further annoyance. I walked over to him in a mood of playfulness, took him by the hair, and laid my fist on his jaw, causing him no physical harm. He said, I think you're a little manic. This was the decided understatement of the case, as I recall the facts. After being apprehended at the country club, he writes, and so the wheel of fortune turns slowly round and round and stops here for a bit of happiness or success and then to dictate another circumstance. I am caught. My father's view of the early days of this particular incarceration. Here within the walls of our state, city, and private psychopathic hospitals are grouped together mortals, sent there because of mental and emotional suffering, sent there to find help, but to receive harsh and painful treatment by brutal nurses and attendants, subject to all manner of barbaric torture, thousands of people locked up to suffer and die, looked down upon, forgotten, their friends and relations, ashamed of them. Now this is what the medical record says about my father's condition when he arrived that day. About an hour or two after admission, this patient became destructive, took his bed, which he managed to bend, and proceeded to knock the plaster off the windowsill, which he succeeded in doing. It was necessary to place him in restraint. It was impossible to reason with him or even converse. It really does take 4 attendants to place this patient in a wet pack sheet. Here is a sort of a selection of a few things he wrote while he was in this hospital. During these days of constant anguish, I was never allowed any food except while in restraint. If one did not open his mouth and swallow what was offered quickly enough, the stuff would usually be emptied into the mouth, partly around the mouth, and it would run in disgusting little rivers down the cheek, onto the neck, finding its way into the pack or jacket. My thoughts wandered with all anchorage eliminated. It seemed that I must have traveled back through the subconscious impressions imposed upon the origin of man, the nature of his soul, and the nature of eternal life. Divorce is a horrible nightmare, but just a part of the great general nightmare of failure, frustration, loss of license to practice, a long and expensive illness, the torrent of disgraces, discouragement, loss of friends, loss of prestige in the community. We are only, to such a limited degree, the pilots of our souls, the captains of our ship. I pray to God that in the future I shall be able to remember that once one has crossed the line from the normal walks of life into a psychopathic hospital, one is separated from friends and relatives by walls thicker than stone, walls of prejudice and superstition. It may be hoped that psychopathic hospitals will someday become a refuge for the mentally ill and a place where they can hope to recover through channels of wise and gentle care. But the modern psychopathic hospitals I have known are direct descendants of the ancient jails like Bedlam, and I believe they do harm, not good. The brutalities that one encounters in state and city psychopathic hospitals must be the byproduct of fear and superstition with which mentally ill patients are regarded. For the present, the best one can hope to do is to stay out of these places, pity those confined there, and to do what one can do to accelerate the slow process of mental hospital reorganization. My license has been revoked. Routine notices began to appear, instructions to notify medical societies and hospitals. My name is withdrawn from the telephone book, from the directory listing in my building, from the door of my office. My heart is slowly breaking. The clouds are black, and I see no silver lining. My father contemplates escaping from Westboro. The instant for escape seemed to be at hand. A sudden gust of wind flew through the branches above me and made two successful sighing sounds, which seemed to say to me, "Go ahead." Instantly, I broke into a run, as fast as I was capable of. I felt as if I were traveling on winged feet. Upon reaching the top of the first hill, I felt very tired, and just before emerging from the trees, I lay down to rest. It was quite dark now, but a full bright moon was coming up, and the sky was filled with stars. As I lay there with the cool breezes blowing across my face and my eyes fixed upon the stars, I felt free again and happy. It was a spring-like day in February 1995 when I visited Westboro State Hospital. I was directed to Codman Building, where my father had been incarcerated many times. The old walls were painted a drab gray, and the corridors on the top and bottom floors were long and dark. One imagined patients from a time past lingering in the shadows. I entered a large room with old oak tables and wondered where my father sat on them, passing his endless days. Wondered whether my father sat on them, passing his endless days. I looked across the lawns from a dusty window and wondered how many times my father had looked through the same window. A heavy old metal staircase connected the floor, and I wondered how many times my father's slippered feet had trod on them. In one sizable room, I removed a sheet of plywood and found a large tub, and recalled how my father had remarked on the filth of it and the toilet, and how his friends had said he was so fastidious. I wondered where they applied the coal packs and straitjackets. If my father had lived today, maybe his life would have been better. Maybe his quest to understand and conquer the thing that destroyed him, he could have gone on for a few more precious months or years, and for that golden time, I could have had a father. After giving a talk much like this, but in more detail, to psychiatry grand rounds at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in August of 1997, a dignified older gentleman sitting in the front row stood up and said the following: "On behalf of the entire specialty of psychiatry, I would like to apologize to you for the way your father was treated during the war years." And Dan, that was John Namaya, who had just retired as chair of psychiatry. Pretty neat. So, that's it in a nutshell. It's easier to write than it is to read. And I'm happy to answer any questions or observations or anything that you all would like to contribute to this evening. Charlotte?
Well, I'm halfway through the book, and I want to ask you how you felt when you opened those papers and you read your father's memory of leaving the country club and his daughter Mimi standing there and saying, "I want to stay with my dad," because I was so moved.
That was in the hotel just before he went. You're absolutely right, to the country club. And when after having so many years where I just didn't know anything about my father, I read that and it was exhilarating. I was so happy. I knew I loved my father no matter what had gone on previously. It was a seminal point. Thank you, Charlotte. Anybody? I know it's hard to respond after hearing all of this, but my father did this for a purpose. So, Anne.
How old were you when you saw him briefly for the second and last?
Oh, the last, let's see.
And what were those circumstances?
The circumstances where my father had come to his Harvard Medical School reunion. And so that was in 1952, and I was born in 1938. So whatever that factors out to, happened to live across the street from the school I went to, Beaver Country Day School. And I left, was called, and left my classroom and just walked home. And that was the last time I saw him. And it was wonderful while it lasted, but it was very brief. And then the next day he came back, and he'd been drinking, unfortunately. And I just watched him sitting on the curb from the upstairs window, and that was the last time I saw him. Liza.
I have a question. What is your extended family's reaction to you publishing this book now?
Well, this is my niece, Mitzi Wilson, sitting right here.
Yeah.
She's ecstatic. Ecstatic. And Mitzi's bipolar herself. And no, this has been, it just, as I said in the book, I wanted to break the code of silence. And that just was so prevalent, and here we were having in each generation incidences of mental illness, and none of us knew what was going on. We weren't prepared, and so this is just, I mean, this is such a release. It's just, we're now talking about it, we're now figuring it out, we're getting people to the doctors, we're getting medication, whatever needs to be happen. So it's terrific. There was a little hesitation. It's hard to be different from the way you were before, and to suddenly be talking turkey was very hard for some people in the family, but we're going to be better for it. Giovanna.
Mimi, can you tell us a little? You wrote this, you worked for 20 years, you did all this research, and then all of a sudden, here we are in the New York Times and the Washington Post yesterday, and can you give us a little bit of that story? How you went from the writing, the creative process, to finding Random. How did Random House find you? I think other people would be interested in hearing that story.
Coolidge Foundation, I'll tell you. I often wondered why I went to work at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. Met Dr. Tanzer. So I had been doing all of this work, left my work for 3 years, Cindy, to do the fundraising for our new building up in Plymouth Notch, and then went back to getting it finished. I was a better person. When I went back to it, I understood my father better. I felt more confident about myself because we had accomplished our mission at the Coolidge Foundation. And a wonderful woman named Amity Schlaze then became head of the Board of Trustees, and she wrote this, recently wrote this terrific book on Coolidge. And so she called me up, and it was in April of 2012, and asked me a few questions about Coolidge, and I tried to answer them, John. And, well, what are you doing now that you're retired? And here she is, a published author, 2 terrific books under her belt. And I said, well, I'm writing this book. And lo and behold, she said, what's it about? I told her. She said, send it to me immediately. And the next thing I know, her very dear friend, Carol Mann, who was one of the foremost agents in New York City, took me under her belt, got me Eve Claxton, who helped me with the submitting book proposal, and then there it was in the office December 12th, 2012, when Random House Crown called, and the rest is history. So it's just, and this book, every time I worked on this book, something amazing happened. The right person was at the library. The right, I got medical records a year before HIPAA, Dan. I mean, hello, that is, and these medical records are so important. They're like gold bricks. So, if something happened with the mic, I don't know. Anyway, I've said enough. So does that answer the question, Giovanna?
I knew the story, but I think other people needed to hear it.
No, thank
It was
you.
very
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you for asking.
Part of the story.
No, my father has been watching over me for this entire time, so I know there are no coincidences. And last Friday, last week was the release of the book, and I came back from New York on Wednesday, and I was sick. I could barely talk, and I had this reading at the library in Woodstock. For 2 hours, I was granted a remission. And I was able to give the talk, answer questions, all of the above the minute I got home. Excuse me. Well, anyway, boring to talk about one's health, but the minute I got home, I was in deep trouble. So I know those 2 hours my father was up there allowing me to get through it. So I did, and today's a lot better than it was last Friday. So I can't tell you what it means for me to look out here and see all your faces, my wonderful friends who have been so supportive. It means everything, and I apologize for getting wavery in my recitation there, but it's kind of a wavery subject. Yes?
Did I read correctly that your mother's father was also taken
Yes.
away?
Yes, we have it on both sides of our family.
Can you talk a little more about, I don't know, how this, like, you know, of all the people on the planet that your mother could have married, she married a man very similar to her father.
That's what we do.
Well, right. But I'm just, you know, I would just love to hear more, like, oh, you're so right, that's what we do. But, how has that panned out for you in your life? Or you could
That's
change.
probably why I made that remark.
Or you could change the subject, however.
My grandfather, my mother's father, was quite a dynamic lawyer. He had already argued in front of the Supreme Court. My grandmother, for whom I'm named, and so is this lovely lady over here, was a real women's liber when we didn't even know the name of that. She was a suffragette. She ran for school board. Her husband allowed her to do all these things. These were, you know, it was amazing. She started out with this amazing career. And obviously my grandfather was engaging and magical and had a lot of charisma. And that's what my mother knew. And he disappeared from her life about the same time as my father disappeared from mine, and he was incarcerated for his entire life in Norristown, Pennsylvania. And I've got the medical records from Norristown, and the disease doesn't get any better with age. Keeps cycling, and cycling. So it was very normal. I mean, the first words that my mother told me when I asked her a question about how she met my father, and she told me about this double date that they went on and with another doctor, and she was a student in drama school in Boston, and they double dated. And her first thing she said was, "Oh, just had the best time with Perry. We just danced all night," and you know, went on and on and on like that. And there it is. And so we do what's familiar and comfortable to us, no matter what the consequences are. I certainly understand myself a lot better now that I've written this book, and understand why I did some of the things that I did, or made the choices I did, or whatever. It's no excuse, but it's helpful to find out the reasons. So. Cookie?
I finished the book at 4:15
Oh.
this afternoon.
Oh.
I was saying to Ernie on the way up is that you've given all this gift of empowerment, and not just for those suffering from manic depression, but we will look at alcoholism or attention deficit disorder and so many of these diseases because of what you have written and how we should approach these issues. And we thank you. It's just a tremendous gift.
You thank my father. He was a teacher. Not only did he go to medical school, but a lot of the professors had him teach the courses he was in. And so he had that instinct, and that's why I read some of these things I did, because it's all him. He wanted to educate people and to try to defray the stigma and for people to try to understand. So that's all the teacher, Perry Baird, the teacher. So just so happened I was able to find his work and complete the mission. Thank goodness. And who was it, Giovanni? You were talking about the reviews. Holy, the reviews have been. You can't even imagine the reviews. The Washington Post, the Boston Globe, now the New York Times. And I just found out before I came over here that they're reviewing the book for inclusion in the New York Times book review on Sundays. I don't know which Sunday it will be, but that was my dream, was to get into the Sunday New York Times book. But I think, and I'm not boasting by telling you all of that, I'm just following up with Cookie that it's done, the book has survived an acid test with these newspapers. They can be very, very difficult on a new author. They don't know me or my father from Adam. And it's the subject. It goes back to what I asked you, how many people here have had a touch or know somebody who's had some mental problems or any kinds of things like that. People are just thirsting for this. I mean, he wrote that back in 1944, and look where we are now. Thank you, Cookie. Thank you. And
The Westboro facility where your father was, is that just empty now? Or
yeah,
is
it just is like I described here. It's just they use it for physical therapy, occupational therapy. They're just state services.
Okay.
So the buildings, they're all neat and tidy. They're just gloomy.
Have you ever been in the facility in Waterbury?
No.
Oh, that is harrowing.
No.
Irene, tropical storm Irene almost
Oh,
did it.
of course.
And,
Right, of course. Yeah, definitely.
Is the bipolar hereditary or
Yes.
so it passes from one generation to another?
Yes, and amazingly enough, here was my father on the steps of sort of the ultimate in medicine, which was the Massachusetts General Hospital. I mean, it really was that way back then, still is now. They kept telling my parents, oh, it's not hereditary, you can have children, because mother didn't want to have children. And they convinced her to have children so that the children could inherit my father's mental, intellectual capabilities. And then lo and behold. And when I first got married, I was told I didn't have to worry about my children because it wasn't hereditary, and we now know it's just flagrantly, very insidious. So, Teresa, I was waiting for you. Teresa works in the mental health field.
As a graduate student
Yes.
in this field, you've given us a gift.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's finally done, Teresa. We've been talking about this for a long time. Yeah,
And I'm finding work for a few.
good, good. Was there, Dan?
No question, just something similar. I just want to say we're all really proud of you.
Oh, gosh. Thank you. I didn't know what it was going to be like to be here with all of you. I certainly had all my friends in Woodstock there on last Friday, but a lot of you here are the people I go to church with, and we share a lot. So this is very special. And Pastor Mike, I now know what it must be like for you on a Sunday to see a full church.
Very good.
Maybe I have one other thing.
Sure.
You were mentioning a password when you started. Abby told me the password is fork.
Oh.
It's a little inside joke.
Oh my gosh, and I didn't say fork, did I, in the
It's a
beginning?
message from John Charbonneau.
And you know what, Ernie said something to me, and I said something about a password, or whatever I said. Well, see, those are the little things that keep us going. Thank you, Dad.
You're welcome.
So, Ab, where are you, dear?
I'm right here, Mabel.
You there?
I'm real proud of you.
Thank you, Ab. Thank you, thank you. Wish your parents were here.
Me too.
Okay, well, I think enough is enough, and
Thank you.